Hey everyone, welcome back. This time, we're going to be doing a deep dive into a fascinating report about fair housing in Baltimore.
It is a fascinating report.
Yeah, it is, and it takes us all the way back to 2011. Think of it like we're opening a time capsule to see what the city's housing landscape looked like back then. So, this report is called Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing Choice, and it was prepared for the city of Baltimore in October 2011.
Yeah, that's right. And this report is more than just a report about houses. It's about understanding how a community functions, how opportunity is shared or not shared, as the case may be, and really how these fair housing laws were being applied way back then.
Yeah, and I think for people who don't follow this topic very closely, just as a reminder, what does fair housing actually mean? I feel like it's one of those terms people hear but might not fully grasp.
Fair housing means that everybody, regardless of their background, should have an equal opportunity to access housing. That means no discrimination based on race, religion, family status, disability, source of income, anything like that. Equal access to housing for everybody.
Got it. So it's about ensuring a level playing field when it comes to housing. And from my initial reading of this report, it seems like Baltimore in 2011 was far from level. The report paints this picture of a city with really stark contrasts, deep racial segregation, big differences in income, and the aftershocks of the 2008 foreclosure crisis were still really rippling through communities.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. The report does hit on all those points. And one of the first things that it digs into is just the extent of racial segregation in Baltimore back then. Almost 60% of neighborhoods in Baltimore were considered racially or ethnically concentrated.
Okay, so they use that word concentrated a lot.
Right.
What does that mean for people who are actually living in these neighborhoods?
Okay. Imagine you are trying to find a new apartment or buy a house, but your options are really limited because most of the neighborhoods around you are predominantly one race or ethnicity. That's what concentration looks like, and in Baltimore's case, many of these concentrated areas were primarily black communities. And while there can certainly be benefits to living near people who share your background and your culture, this kind of extreme concentration can really limit housing choices, especially since, as we know, the surrounding counties were much less diverse at the time. This report really reinforces that fair housing isn't just a city issue, it's a regional issue.
It's kind of like an invisible wall that's limiting where people can live, and the report gets really specific. There's a table, figure 1 to 3, which breaks down the racial makeup of all these different census tracts. I noticed, for example, tract 1501 in Baltimore at the time was over 90% black.
Yes, it's figures like those that really just highlight how stark the segregation was. And these patterns, as we know, are often rooted in decades of discriminatory policies and practices, things like redlining that steered certain people into certain neighborhoods and away from others.
Yeah, it really makes you think about those concentrated neighborhoods and wonder how much of that is due to choices that people made versus choices that were made for them, you know? But the report doesn't stop at just segregation, right? It connects this to the income gap between different racial groups in Baltimore.
That's right. There's a very substantial difference in median household income between different racial groups in Baltimore. For example, in Figure 1 to 6, we see Black and Hispanic households were earning considerably less than white and Asian households in 2011.
And can you give us like some specific numbers just to make that more tangible?
Yeah, so the median income for Black households was around $30,000, while for white households it was closer to $50,000.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
It is a huge gap, and we all know that income plays a big role in where people can afford to live. Lower income just means fewer options. Plain and simple. It's not just about finding a roof over your head, it's about having access to safe, decent, and affordable housing in neighborhoods that have good schools, parks, all of the things that make for a thriving community.
Right. So when you look at figure 1 to 8, which maps out areas of low and moderate income in the city, do you see a connection between those areas and the areas of racial concentration that we were just talking about?
Yes, there is a very strong connection. So not only were certain groups concentrated in certain neighborhoods, but those neighborhoods were also more likely to have lower median incomes.
So it's like this double whammy of segregation and income disparity, creating a very uneven playing field.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the third big issue that this report dives into, the affordability crunch. Now, we're talking 2011 here, just a few years after the housing market crash. But this report shows that housing costs in Baltimore were actually going up.
Yes, I know. It's kind of counterintuitive, right?
You would think a housing crisis would mean lower costs.
Exactly, you would think.
Yeah.
But according to this report, the median home value increased by over 65% between 1990 and 2008. But at the same time, during that same period, real household income actually decreased.
Wait, so people are making less money, but housing is getting more expensive. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Yes, it was a major squeeze, especially for renters. And this report highlights a really shocking statistic. A minimum wage worker would have needed to work over 100 hours a week just to afford a two-bedroom apartment at fair market rent.
100 hours a week, that's like 3 full-time jobs,
Hmm.
just to keep a roof over your head.
Exactly. And the report also calculated what they called the housing wage, which is the hourly rate that someone would need to earn to afford a modest two-bedroom apartment without being cost burdened. And in Baltimore in 2011, that wage was 19.94 per hour,
Wow.
which was a world away from the actual minimum wage at the time, which was 7.25. So even if you were working full-time at a minimum wage job, you were essentially priced out of decent housing.
Yeah, so you have this situation where housing costs are rising, incomes are stagnant or falling, and you have this foreclosure crisis that's happening all at the same time.
Right. It creates this perfect storm of housing instability.
It does, and Baltimore was right in the eye of that storm. It had the second highest foreclosure rate in all of Maryland, even higher than the surrounding counties. Let me guess. These foreclosures were not hitting all neighborhoods equally.
You got it. Predominantly black neighborhoods were being hit the hardest. And I think this is where it's really crucial to connect this back to the long history of discriminatory housing practices here in the U.S. We're talking things like redlining.
For decades, policies and practices like redlining, you know, systematically denied black families access to loans and opportunities to buy homes in certain neighborhoods, right?
Exactly.
Which meant they were often steered towards less desirable areas that had fewer resources and lower property values.
That's right. So when the foreclosure crisis hit, these same communities, they were the ones who were disproportionately impacted. It wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of deliberate systemic discrimination that really made these communities much more vulnerable.
So it's like this vicious cycle where past injustices really create the conditions for present-day hardship. And this report makes it very clear that these foreclosures weren't just about losing homes. They were about losing wealth, losing stability, losing opportunity. It's really heartbreaking.
Absolutely. This report doesn't shy away from pointing out how past injustices continue to shape the housing landscape in Baltimore. And it's a really stark reminder that fair housing isn't just about creating equal opportunity in the present, it's also about addressing that lasting legacy of inequality that's really baked into our housing system.
Yeah. So we've talked about segregation, income disparity, and the foreclosure crisis, how all those things sort of converged to create this really challenging situation in Baltimore back in 2011. But I'm guessing the report doesn't stop there.
It doesn't.
What other aspects of fair housing does this report explore?
The report goes on to examine other barriers to fair housing in Baltimore, including accessibility challenges for people with disabilities and issues with language access for residents who don't speak English.
Let's dive into those a little bit. Let's start with accessibility. What did the report reveal about that?
The report points out some pretty significant concerns about the lack of accessible housing for people with disabilities. In fact, it references a lawsuit from 2002 where the Baltimore Housing Authority was found in violation of federal law for not having enough accessible units.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't a new problem even back in 2011.
Not at all, no. And that lawsuit led to something called the Bailey Consent Decree, which forced the Housing Authority to improve accessibility. But this 2011 report shows that there were still significant gaps when it came to providing truly accessible housing for everyone.
And it wasn't just about public housing, right? I remember reading something in the report about developers of multifamily housing.
Hmm.
They weren't always complying with accessibility requirements either.
That's right. You know, the Fair Housing Act applies across the board, whether it's public housing, private rentals, or homes for sale. Everyone has the right to live in a place that meets their needs, and that includes people with disabilities.
So we're seeing how multifaceted this issue is. It's not just about who gets to live in what neighborhood, but also about making sure that the housing itself is accessible and adaptable for everyone. But at this point, I'm kind of wondering, what does the report say about the city's own role in all of this? Were there policies and programs actually helping or hindering fair housing efforts back in 2011?
That's a great question, and it's exactly what the next section of the report digs into. And it kind of reveals a mixed bag, some successes, but also some clear areas needing improvement.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me the highlights. What are some of the key takeaways about Baltimore's own policies?
Well, for starters, the report acknowledges that the city had some programs like Home and CDBG, which were investing in affordable housing, which is great.
Yeah.
But it also found that those investments weren't always being made in ways that promoted integration or expanded housing choices for everyone.
So maybe building more affordable housing, but potentially concentrating it in areas that were already concentrated.
Right, exactly. And then there's the city's zoning code. It was being revised at the time, and some of the proposed changes had the potential to help fair housing efforts, but others could have actually made things worse.
Okay, so give me an example of each. What's a change that could have helped and a change that could have hurt?
Okay, so a potential positive was allowing more residential use in commercial areas. This could have created more diverse housing options in different neighborhoods, giving people more choices. But on the flip side, increasing minimum lot sizes could have hurt affordability. Larger lots mean fewer units can be built, which usually drives up prices and really limits options for lower income families.
So it's a classic case of unintended consequences.
It is. And something else that stood out to me was the lack of representation of people with disabilities on a lot of these citizen boards. These boards play a key role in shaping city policies, so it's really crucial to have diverse voices at the table.
Right. If the people making decisions aren't representative of the community as a whole, then that's a problem. It almost feels like we're circling back to that core issue of representation that we were talking about with segregated neighborhoods.
It is all connected, and I think that's why this report really stresses the need for a more holistic, integrated approach to fair housing in Baltimore. It's not just about tweaking a program here or a policy there, it's about having a citywide vision and a citywide commitment to fair housing principles in everything the city does.
I like that. A citywide vision. But before we get there, there's one more impediment we need to discuss. Language access.
Yes. This is another crucial aspect of fair housing that often gets overlooked. At the time, Baltimore had a growing population of residents with limited English proficiency, speaking languages like Spanish, Chinese, Russian.
And the report seemed concerned about the city's ability to adequately serve these residents.
Absolutely. They did have a communications protocol for language access, but the report criticizes it as insufficient, potentially hindering equal access to housing programs and services.
So good intentions, but maybe falling short in practice. Kind of a common theme here.
It does seem to be a theme, yeah. And the report makes a very specific recommendation that the city analyze whether they should proactively translate vital documents, things like housing applications, leases, information about tenants' rights, into other languages.
That makes a lot of sense. You can't expect people to navigate complex housing applications, understand their rights, if they can't even read the information.
Right. It's about removing those barriers and ensuring that everyone can understand and access the resources available to them. And I think this really brings us to the heart of this report's message, which is a call for a more comprehensive and proactive approach to fair housing in Baltimore.
Okay, so I'm ready for the big picture.
hmm
What does that actually look like? What kind of recommendations does this report lay out?
Well, it doesn't exactly lay out a step-by-step plan, but it offers some guiding principles and some suggestions. And it really starts by emphasizing the need for a really clear citywide policy statement on fair housing.
So like a mission statement, but specifically for fair housing.
Yeah, exactly. Something that really sets the tone and makes it clear that Baltimore is committed to upholding these fair housing principles in all its actions. And beyond that, it calls for much better coordination across city agencies and programs. Remember, we were talking about all those programs with good intentions,
Yeah,
but maybe not always the best execution. It's like, let's get everyone working together, sharing information, coordinating their efforts so we can achieve these shared goals.
right. It's like you can have all these individual pieces in place, but if they're not working in sync, it's not going to be very effective.
Exactly, exactly. And the report even suggests some really concrete areas for improvement. For example, remember when we were discussing the site selection for affordable housing?
Yeah, like where those new units are actually built.
Yeah. Yes. The report recommends that the city develop a formal policy to guide those decisions, ensuring that investments in affordable housing are made in a way that promotes integration and expands housing choices for everyone. It's about being strategic and intentional with where these developments are located.
So not just building more units, but really thinking about how those units can help create more balanced and diverse neighborhoods. I like that. It's a more proactive approach.
It is, it is. And it ties into another one of the key recommendations, which is regional collaboration. The report acknowledges that Baltimore can't solve these issues alone. The surrounding counties play a huge role in shaping the regional housing market, and it's really going to take a coordinated effort to make some real progress here.
It's like you can't just draw a line around the city and say, okay, fair housing problem solved within these boundaries,
Yeah,
right?
right.
People
Yeah.
move, they commute, they search for housing across a wider area. It's all connected.
Exactly. Fair housing is a regional issue, and the report emphasizes that the solutions really need to reflect that reality. And so I think it's important to remember that this report is really just a snapshot in time.
Right.
It can't predict the future, but it does plant seeds for further investigation, right? It raises these questions that you, as the listener, can continue to explore.
I love that. So the deep dive doesn't end here.
Oh,
We're
yeah.
handing the reins over to our listeners.
That's right. And there are definitely some intriguing threads to pull on. For instance, remember that lawsuit against Wells Fargo for predatory lending that we talked about earlier? Well, it turns out that case was actually dismissed twice in federal court,
Hmm.
but the city was allowed to file an amended complaint. So what happened next? Did they ultimately win that case? What kind of impact did it have on lending practices in Baltimore? Those are all questions worth exploring.
It's fascinating. And what about the Bailey consent decree? Did the housing authority actually meet those requirements? What's the state of accessible housing in Baltimore today? I mean, these are all questions we need to be asking.
They are. And don't stop there. Think about all those broader trends that we discussed: segregation, income inequality, affordability. Have those issues improved or gotten worse since 2011? What new challenges have emerged?
I can feel my researcher brain kicking into gear already. All the articles and reports and data that I need to dig into. It's like this deep dive has opened up this whole new world of questions and avenues for exploration.
It has.
And this is what I love about having these conversations. They're not just about like passively absorbing information. They're about sparking that curiosity, encouraging people to keep learning and asking questions.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of this report. It's not just a dry historical document. It's a catalyst for deeper understanding, a tool for sparking really meaningful conversations and driving positive change. And I think it's a reminder that this journey towards fair housing doesn't end with a single report or a single policy. It's an ongoing process that requires constant attention, advocacy, and really a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Well said. And speaking of challenging the status quo, I think it's time we shift gears a bit and delve into some specific examples of how these fair housing issues actually play out in real life.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, ultimately, this is about understanding how all these abstract concepts like redlining and zoning and all this stuff, how that actually impacts real people, families, and communities.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in all the data and the policy jargon, but it's really important to remember that behind all those numbers, there are real stories, real struggles, real triumphs.
Right. Data can tell us one story, but hearing directly from people who have been impacted by these issues, I think adds a whole other layer of understanding. It's about connecting with that human side of fair housing.
Exactly. So let's bring this report to life a little bit by exploring some real-world examples of how these issues have played out in Baltimore. We'll look at some specific cases and some stories and some anecdotes that really illustrate the challenges, the complexities, and just the ongoing fight for fair housing in this city.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture of fair housing in Baltimore way back in 2011. The segregation, the income disparities, the foreclosure crisis, and all those policy gaps that we were discussing. But, I think what really brings this report to life are the personal stories that are kind of woven throughout. Like all those quotes from residents who actually shared their experiences with housing discrimination. I mean, that's powerful stuff.
It is. Those firsthand accounts are so important. They remind us that we're not just talking about abstract concepts here. These are real-life struggles that people are facing every single day.
Absolutely. And there was one quote in the report from a resident who talked about being told an apartment was already rented. But then her white friend called later and was told it was still available. I mean, that's blatant discrimination.
It is. It shows how insidious this kind of discrimination can be. It's not always about signs that say, no blacks allowed, right?
Right.
It can be much more subtle than that. It can be hidden in the way landlords screen applicants or the information they choose to share or not share.
It's just like this hidden code that only some people know how to crack. And the report highlights how this kind of discrimination can really have this ripple effect, across generations.
Right.
Like how the denial of home ownership opportunities to, Black families in the past, how that's contributed to this huge wealth gap that we see today.
Absolutely. It's this vicious cycle. When entire communities are systematically denied access to homeownership, which we know is one of the primary ways for families to build wealth, it creates this lasting disadvantage that can be passed down from one generation to the next.
So it's a reminder that fair housing isn't just about the present. It's about repairing the damage of past injustices. It's about creating a more equitable future. And the report doesn't shy away from actually naming those injustices like redlining and these predatory lending practices. It even mentions that lawsuit that the city filed against Wells Fargo, I think it was, for predatory lending in predominantly Black neighborhoods.
Right. And that lawsuit is such a perfect example of how these issues play out, in the legal arena. And it raises so many questions about accountability and the role of financial institutions in perpetuating housing inequality.
Oh, so many layers to unpack. This is what I love about doing these deep dives with you. It's not just about absorbing information. It's about sparking critical thinking. It's about inspiring further exploration, right?
Exactly.
So what happened with that Wells Fargo lawsuit? Did the city actually win? What impact did that have?
Great questions.
And then what about those broader trends we've been talking about? The segregation, the income disparities, the affordability crisis. Have those things gotten any better in Baltimore since 2011? Or have they actually gotten worse?
These are all questions that you, as the listener, can continue to investigate. And I would encourage you, don't limit yourself to just data and reports. Go out and seek out those lived experiences of people in Baltimore. Talk to residents, talk to community organizers, housing advocates. Really get a feel for how these issues are playing out on the ground today.
I love it. So the deep dive continues, but now it's in your hands. You have the tools, you have the knowledge to go out and dig deeper, connect the dots, and really become an informed and engaged citizen on this incredibly important issue.
Exactly. And as you do that, keep this in mind. Fair housing is not just about laws and policies. It's about people. It's about ensuring that everyone has a safe, affordable, and welcoming place to call home, regardless of their background, their circumstances. It's about creating a Baltimore where everyone has a fair shot at a good life. And this report, even though it's from, over a decade ago, it's a powerful reminder that this fight for fair housing is far from over.
It's not over. It's an ongoing struggle that requires constant vigilance, advocacy, and really a commitment to justice and equality. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a Baltimore where everyone has a real opportunity to thrive.
That's right.
That's the true legacy of this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.